thank Raisina for planning this session on a very hot topic, and thanks for joining us. You know, to make sure I was myself and my panelists very disciplined on timing, I had prepared a joke saying, okay, we are all here at Raisina for food for thought, but at lunchtime we are also looking for food, and we, the panelists, are what is in between, because the food was to be served at the end of our panel, so what you are in between us and food. But then they changed the program, so what can I tell you? To be disciplined, I have to ask my panelists to be quick and effective, because digestion will start soon, and so some of these young leaders will start sleeping if we are not effective.
You want to eat too, by the way.
Let's be honest, we had something as well, so let's not worry. So I will be disciplined myself, and I will take 1 minute out of the 4 I was given to introduce the topic. First, Trump trade session, then COVID, then conflicts, and new trade tension and sanctions all have interrupted, or at least complicated, the movement of goods. Food, the one you're eating right now, fuel, fertilizer, and more. All them contributed to a perfect storm, which is actually far from perfect, because it has actually proved, luckily, to be less powerful than we feared, at least so far. And the power of the storm depends very much on the sea you are navigating. It is a mild storm so far, right now, in Europe. It is wild in the Indian Ocean, and the storm is still raging, as it is in sub-Saharan Africa. So, we will have one round of questions for each of the panelists, but before we get into that, I have a very quick question to all of you. Do you believe that what we are experiencing is this block, this difficulty in movement of food, fertilizer, fuel, is going to be temporary or permanent? So in a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being temporary, which is good, and 10 being permanent, how would you, Gwendolyn, assess the situation for the future?
Thank you. I think I will rate it a 7, because we have had an incredible backlog that can't go away overnight. So my rating will be a 7, because we need time to adjust. And a lot of economies, particularly those in Africa, were not prepared, didn't have the infrastructure. So I'll give it a good 7.
7, which is a bad 7, by the way. 7 means more permanent than temporary. What about you, Heribert?
Well, there are two answers to your question. The first would be, if we leave the supply chain redevelopment to the private sector, I would give it a 2. But if we leave it to the governments, I would give it an 8. And I'm afraid we currently see a wave of thinking in terms of autarky, of self-reliance. So I'm somewhere in between 8 and 2. But if the private sector would reorganize the supply chains, we see a lot of positive developments there. And if the governments would stay out of it, it would be positive.
Good point. Dino, what's your assessment?
Well, in Munich Security Conference, President Zelensky said that Ukraine will win the war this year. I hope Ukraine will win, but I don't know if that's going to happen this year. And another thing is the Black Sea Grain Initiative that will expire next month, and we don't know if it's going to be extended this month. Yeah? We don't know if it's going to be extended this year, but with those circumstances, I would give it a 4, temporary.
Okay, so you are more positive. So far, the most positive. I mean, his average could be 4, more or less, because 2 and 8, it's in between. Benedetta.
I reckon I would give it a 6, partly because, of course, it depends on how we handle this crisis, this combination of simultaneous crises. So I see hope But in the intermediate, in the short to midterm future, I would think it's more likely that we will continue to have a complex security environment, growing strategic competition, and that will also have a negative impact on international cooperation at large, and then more specifically also food security.
Thank you, Benedetta. Sachin?
Thank you. Thanks, Paolo. I think I would give it 5. I feel that with the sort of rebounding of economy in several parts of the world, supply chain disruptions are being adequately addressed. In some areas, of course, as we heard, challenges are going to be there. So I'm not giving it 2, but I think that if we take from medium to a short-term perspective, this would be addressed. So I feel it should be 5.
Thank you. But I just want to pick up one of the many interesting points you all made, what Heribert said. If we leave it to the economy, which means interdependence, which means the usual, it's the economy stupid, it will go away soon. But the big news out of these crises, and one in particular, is that we moved from it's the economy stupid into it's geopolitics stupid. We moved from interdependence to weaponized interdependence. And this is something which, as you said, oblige us to stay in the middle. 5, we don't know. 5 means we don't know. It can be temporary, or my papers went down, but I will try to find a way. So 5 means we don't know. 5 means it could be terrible, temporary, or could be permanent. We don't know. Now, let's move into the other question which we were suggested to raise. And the second question has to do with the cost for vulnerable economies, and has to do on which new internal and external threats these crises can cause to vulnerable economies in first. And I think, Gwendolyn, you can share with us a few comments on your continent, on Africa, and then I will ask you, Dino, to share a few comments on Asia.
Thank you, Paolo. I think moving from the first point I made, rating it at 7, is because of the continent in Africa. A lot of the countries in Africa do not have the infrastructures in place to provide food for themselves, which is ironical. We depend a lot on imports for what we eat. On the fuel side, a lot of the countries are oil-producing countries, but ironically, again, we import fuel. If you look at all of this, that's why I say it's something that is going to take time for us to be able to get over this backlog. Now, what are the cost effects that we are seeing? We have seen the inflation rates rising. We have seen cost of living, going through the roof. We have also seen people losing jobs, because you know that in our African continent, a lot of the labor is in an informal sector. So you have those who were depending on the ships coming into the countries to be able to offload, who now no longer had jobs because of the delays in the supply chain. We have those who used to really count on those imports because they were working in the warehouses and the factories that used to receive those imports. They no longer have that. You have those who were dependent, on the farms that needed the fertilizers to be able to plant, who no longer could work because of that. So the impact is on the economy, it's on the communities, and it has a long-lasting effect because it's affecting health as well, because a lot of the medical supplies, if you look at what happened during COVID, most of the basic supplies needed for COVID had to be imported for most of the African countries. So the difficulties and the negative impacts are seen, clearly seen, from inflation, price hikes, loss of jobs, and it's going to continue as we move along. We have recently also had to start seeing fuel prices that were formerly subsidized now being hiked in most of the countries in our continent.
But Gwendolyn, so you stress one crucial issue, which is in low-income or middle-income country, the consumer basket is heavily affected by food, And you mentioned that in Africa, 80 to 90% of the food is imported. So food is a large part of your consumer basket, and that food comes from outside. If the price increase, it's a mess. Now, what would you expect? I mean, would you expect, because on the financial side, we know that some country, the raise of interest rate is producing a risk of default, increasing risk of default. But what would you expect on the social and political impact of what's going on now?
On the social and political impact, you see the governments are struggling. Governments are struggling because they can no longer continue to subsidize food prices. In Cameroon, if I take the example, the price of bread is subsidized. The price of fuel is subsidized. The price of so many items are subsidized, but the government has come under a lot of strain and can no longer subsidize, and have started releasing it, for example, fuel. We don't know if the cost of bread will be able to continue being subsidized. So the government has a lot of stress right now trying to manage the demand from the population that they have to fend for. We have had the price of fuel increase. At the same time, the government is trying to increase civil servant salary by 5% to try to create a balance. But this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable because now the government policy has to change. Before, we were focused on infrastructure, building roads and the rest, but now we have to move into agri-industry to be able to start looking for ways to produce food locally so that we are not dependent on imports.
And you are all very young, and to understand, assess how crazy this world has become, for 30 years, the International Monetary Fund would go to African country and tell them, you have to cut subsidies. Subsidies are bad. And now we are all introducing subsidies, and we hope countries have financial room to keep subsidies on. So, but till 2 years ago, they were toxic. To get money from the International Monetary Fund, you have to present a plan to cut subsidies, because subsidy would destroy the market. So this is bring us into another big issue. But Dino, what about Asia? Thank you, Gwendolyn.
Well, 600 million people who are classified as hungry in the world. 300 million, half of them live in Asia. Right? So definitely we're going to be impacted by it. And we've never seen anything like this, to be honest. So you talk about the perfect storm. This is a multiple crisis. In 2008, when we had a global financial crisis, it was just a financial crisis. Yeah. But this time, in the last 2 years, we've been hit by the pandemic crisis, and then the food crisis, right? And then also in some parts of Asia, the debt of the financial crisis, and then the fuel crisis, right? So we got all these multiple crises, and on top of that, don't forget there are some countries who were unfortunate enough to be hit by climate crisis. This happened to Pakistan, where tens of million people were displaced. And also on top of that, you can add the political crisis. In Sri Lanka, for example, the food price rose by 90%, right? And that affected a quarter of the population, 22 million, into food insecurity. Yeah. So definitely, if you ask me about the cost first would be on human security. Right? Millions have been very much affected by it. And it also affects sense of social stability, and to some extent in some countries political instability. When the price of cooking oil in Indonesia rose, our president, who's very popular, it dipped down. Right? The only moment that he dipped down was when the cooking oil price went up dramatically.
And which country would you consider more at financial or political risk in the continent?
Indonesia, I would not say so because we are maintaining high growth of 5%, but I would say Myanmar, where there's a combined conflict of humanitarian, political, and security. Obviously, Pakistan, risk being a failed economy. Yeah. Sri Lanka remains very much in the dark. the Afghanistan, obviously, that's going to be
The forgotten
huge,
Afghanistan.
yeah. But fortunately, my region, except for Myanmar, we are proving to be quite resilient to the extent that the theme of ASEAN this year is the epicentrum of growth.
And Gwendolyn, what about Africa? Which country could be mostly affected by either the financial or the political crisis? And by the way, they are intertwined.
You're already seeing countries like Nigeria that are suffering with devaluation. You're seeing Ghana that have rates of inflation that are in the double digits, that are already experiencing it, and you have the bonds that cannot be paid. So countries that you did not expect, you know, of course. You have countries even if you look at countries like Chad, Central African Republic, because they have been having political crises, they have been in civil wars for at least 6 years. So this crisis just came to multiply what was happening. You have countries that have aging presidents, that there's already that tension of, is he going to stay on? What is succession going to be? You have Cameroon, you just have Nigeria that just did an election, and we also see another aging president coming on. So we already have the effects very apparent already for some of these countries, and these are things that are not going to be able to be managed in the next 1 or 2 years. So we need a lot of work, and we already have the bulk of these countries in the Central African region that are under the IMF program as you manage. And there's that increased pressure of increased fuel prices. Do not subsidize this, but is it sustainable? Can we make it through that? I'm not too sure.
You are all eating, and we are all discussing terrible scenarios. To allow you to digest, let me tell you that we have been forecasting these terrible scenarios since COVID. You remember, we started saying many countries will implode after COVID because it's an health crisis, which will become also an economic crisis. And the reality is that the worst has not happened so far. That doesn't mean we have to be stupidly optimistic, but it means that the worst scenarios, we started having these scenarios in 2021 with COVID, has not materialized so far. So having said that, let me move to the third driving question, asking the remaining panelists, how can countries and or international organization or the international community react or adapt to these interrupted supply chains which may provoke all the crises we have mentioned? And I will start with Sachin, asking you to focus mainly on the international community possible reaction and help.
Thank you. Thanks, Paulo. I think when we talk about supply chain disruption, Paulo, we would have to see what all sectors we are including, where we are seeing the supply chain disruption. And I feel it has to be deciphered at 2 levels. COVID crisis has given some countries capacity to see what they can produce. And the earlier idea which several economic schools and international institutions have propelled in terms of survival of the fittest or the competitive advantage, Ricardo's competitive advantage. I think that theoretical construct also we would have to see in the post-COVID crisis to see how the national policies are to be geared in terms of production and how do we go forward. And that's where, Paulo, we would have to see how certain schools of thought have propelled the idea that those who are able to produce best should only be producing and rest should be just consuming. And this is how international financial institutions, international scientific establishments, and the entities that facilitated these dialogues have propelled. Time has come to change that. Time has come for countries to enable them to produce what they have been producing. And I give you just one example from India, and I would explain that for other countries as well. In India, we thought that the API, which we all need for production of pharmaceuticals, the raw material for pharmaceuticals, somehow the public sector enterprises which were producing them were running into red. They were the only ones which were supplying. During COVID crisis, disruption of supply chain, China stopped sending it to India. Before that, we had face-off with China just before the COVID crisis in Pulwama, and things stopped. Then the government geared up. Fortunately, my institution, and I was personally part of the team to see how much imports were to phase out, etc. And you won't believe, 2019, when we were dependent 92% of API import from China to India, and this is when the world recognizes India as a world's pharmacy, as a generic producer. And we were dependent on China. 2019 and 2023, when we are sitting here, I checked the data last week, and we have reduced our import dependence on China for API, for pharmaceutical productions of generics. It is now only 61%. 61%. And this is when a huge focus was on production of vaccines, which we supplied all across. 2 billion doses we supplied to the world. But at the same time, government had a very focused program under PLI and many other schemes to enhance pharmaceutical production. Now, if you see this as a development for disruption of supply chain, by all means, I think my number 5 that I gave to your question of whether yes or no, I think perfectly fine. Because then you have created capacity, which India already had. 1970 to 1991, India created a huge capacity to produce APIs. And we lost out because we thought that biopharmaceuticals and biosimilars are the way forward. And from that perspective, I think now the way CGIAR is being funded, the way CGIAR is enabling countries to choose the crops that they want to grow, and how we want to create Africa as production hub for many of these items. The AFCFTA, the African Free Trade Agreement, is emphasizing more on investment than on trade. I think, Paolo, the time has come that after COVID crisis, after supply chain disruption, world should explore new theoretical nuancing of the development paradigm. Time has come for that.
Very good point. In the old world, till a few years ago, having a panel on food shortage, on fuel shortage, having someone from NATO to talk would have been bizarre. What has a security organization has to say on food shortage? But in a world of weaponized interdependence, listening to what NATO thinks on the issue becomes relevant. Benedetta.
Yeah. No, I got the hint that it was my turn. Right. So the question is, why is this relevant to us? Why is it relevant from a security organization? Well, and now we are adapting, if I reckon correctly. Few points come to mind. I think step one is the current world situation, growing strategic competition and growing instability. The perfect storm, as you called it, first of all, needs, in my opinion, to lead us to do some rethinking in terms of basic assumptions. So for many years we thought that globalization, economic interdependence would lead to more cooperation and essentially will lead us to positive entanglements. And of course that's true to some extent. It does work. It can work. But of course entanglements go both ways. So you can have a positive entanglement or you can have a critical dependency. And what can be a tool of cooperation can be also a tool of contestation. And today we see more and more how non-military means, from disinformation to food security to energy security, is weaponized, has been weaponized, is going to be weaponized, and our critical dependencies are going to be used against us. And so as opposed to a tool of cooperation, you see more and more the competitive nature of this issue. So that's why it matters to security, I would say. And we see today how food, fuel, fertilizer is being used actively as a tool of war. we haven't mentioned Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It's not just the elephant in the room. It's incredibly essential to understand why what we're talking about is happening to such a scale, and it's not by default, it is by design, right? So I think it's important we put it at the center of the table. First of all, as a tool of war, Russia is deliberately targeting Ukraine's critical infrastructure, energy grid, deliberately and systematically targeting everything that has to do with the food production and supply chain. So that's I think, very important. It's not a crisis manufactured out of thin air. It's not a collateral damage of war. It is deliberate. And it's a deliberate tool of coercion. It's a deliberate tool to try to starve the world as a way to gain leverage. So I think it's important that we are quite precise as to what we're seeing and why there is such there is this crisis at the moment. So what are we learning? We're learning quite a lot, I think. Hopefully, someone could say we could have learned it earlier. I take the point, but over the last year, as Europeans, we have taken drastic and rapid steps to wean ourselves off Russian oil and gas. The lesson learned is do not have one-sided dependencies on potential adversaries and competitors or on authoritarian assertive regimes. That does not work, and the steps that have been taken are significant. They're also positive in terms of energy transition, but they also are positive in terms of lowering our dependency on Russian oil and gas. But more importantly, I think the lesson learned is about critical dependencies. And of course, as we wean ourselves of that dependency, we shouldn't import others from other authoritarian regimes, and of course I'm thinking China. So that's a lesson. It's about resilience. It's about resilience of our infrastructure, of our critical technologies, of our critical supply chain. It's not about protectionism or closing up, but it is about friendshoring. It is about building up better cooperation with like-minded partners globally. And I think that's, and it is about concerted international action to uphold the rules-based international order. And then we go back we go back where we started, which is with Russia's war against Ukraine.
You know, again, you are very young, and you know that our definition on who is a friend and who is an enemy is very flexible. Because now that we go to buy from democratic country, we are buying fossil from Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Azerbaijan, Qatar, and Algeria, which are famous to be extremely democratic country in the world. But as I said, sorry, wait, hold on a second. No, I just wanted to underline that we are very flexible. I wanted on this to ask a reaction to the very important point with Benedetta made, which is shared in Europe, which means this is what we believe in Europe, strongly believe in Europe. This is not a collateral damage. This is deliberate, and the responsibility is on Russia. This is the common view in Europe. Can I ask our Asian friends and our African friend, this is something which is a common view in your continent as well, or if this is something we are believing and assessing ourselves, but as a different perception in other countries, continents? Gwendolyn. So Benedetta said what is a common view in Europe, which is the food crisis, the fuel crisis, is not a collateral damage of the war in Ukraine. Is a deliberate decision of Russia to starve the rest of the world and blame Ukraine and Europe. Is that can I phrase it that way, Benedetta?
There was a food crisis before the war started, so it would be simplistic, but I would say that the Russia is deliberately weaponizing food, yes.
Okay, so.
Well, that is really...
I'm not asking your opinion. I'm asking what the common view in your continent, or the view in your continent. Of course,
yes.
for you as well.
I think for us, and I wouldn't want to speak for the continent, but because Africa is quite diverse. North Africans and Southern Africans are a bit more advanced than Western and Central Africans. So it's difficult to speak for the continent. I don't look at it really as, from my point of view, as Russia set out to weaponize food. There's just there's a food crisis, and the reason for the food crisis is because of what has happened. So whether it's weaponized or not does not change the fact that there is a food crisis. So I just believe that the consequences of the Ukraine-Russian war has created a food crisis, has created a fuel crisis, and coming after the COVID pandemic and the financial crisis, it is just exacerbated. So for
Dino,
me, that is how.
Thank you. So I didn't want you to speak for the continent. You are right. I mean, what's the view?
Well, I think one of the biggest surprises for Western governments is that as they try to engage the global South on this issue, they found that many in the global South are resistant. In fact, critical towards the West, and there are quite a few pro-Russian sentiments. That's happening in Southeast Asia as well, including in my country. My group has been vocal criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we are somewhat a minority, right? But I think, with notwithstanding the debate about weaponizing food security, the key is very simple. If Russia abides by the UN resolution to leave Ukraine unconditionally and immediately, and all forces are withdrawn from Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, I think a great part of the food insecurity that is happening around the world will be lifted.
It's a strong statement. Sachin, thank you.
Paulo, I think we cannot take this sweeping view, and I personally feel that the weaponization of food and connecting Russia with that probably is extreme in terms of how this is being seen. But I feel definitely this is outcome of the crisis. The whole point that we have been making in terms of Black Sea Grain Initiative or the UN Russia MOU that was signed sometime in July 22. I think these are some of the dimensions where Russia is responding to the challenge, and we need to see how best we can prevail after the crisis. So in my view, this is more a crisis, and then as beautifully captured in terms of a lot of other challenges which are coupled with this. And this probably, Paulo, you need to appreciate that after the other challenges that we had in Asia, be that Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq, we are time and again seeing, and this is why this time West is not getting that response which they got earlier from several Asian countries, including from South Asia. So countries are not that passionately linked as Europe is seeing the crisis and putting Russia into that.
Good point. And now, Heribert, your view on what we should do to react or to adapt to this supply chain crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me first of all say that what we saw in the crisis, in the COVID pandemic, was that we saw a large wave of hoarding, both in the private domain and in the corporate domain. Companies were hoarding, and that increased the shortage of supply. The Hungarian economist János Kornai has written about that, this characterized socialist economies. It was not a shortage of production, it was the hoarding that made life difficult. And we all have those. I was in Hong Kong at the time. We all have those toilet paper supply pictures in front of us. That happened, and that made the crisis deeper. So this is going away. We see that the costs of container shipping have normalized completely. At the peak, a container from East Asia to Europe was $15,000. It's less than $2,000 now. So things are normalizing because the panic is going away, the hoarding is going away, and so things are improving at one level. But we do have, of course, a significant shortage of supply in the poorest countries. We have heard that. I would like to emphasize that the number of people in absolute poverty is rising dramatically, and the question is, why has that happened? Now, of course, one position is to say it's exclusively the fault of Russia. My take is that the Western reaction to the illegitimate, one has to say that these days, illegitimate, illegal, and so on, invasion of Ukraine has been the weaponization of trade and finance, and I don't think that this has been a good idea. We have been using trade and finance to punish Russia, but the bill is paid by the world's poorest, and the world's poorest have not been asked whether they want to share this policy. This is a big problem, and we don't see that the number of countries that are applying sanctions against Russia is rising. The current number is, I think, 32 or 34. 33, okay, I was close, huh? And we have a substantial opposition in this part of the world also. Foreign Minister Jaishankar complained. He complained about the Germans. This is always useful. He complained about Germany buying liquefied natural gas, which we never used. We didn't even have a terminal for it. We buy liquefied natural gas in this part of the world with the German finance minister's relatively fat wallet. And we push countries like Bangladesh into trouble which have nothing to do with that conflict. And I don't think this is wise, this is fair, this is appropriate. And Jaishankar complained that that is the Indian government, we have not been even invited to submit a tender for LNG because the Europeans are buying it all. So that's one point. Let me just briefly say one thing on finance, because I think we do harm to our own financial system. We don't do harm to the Russian financial system. We do undermine confidence in our own Western financial system. Just to illustrate the point, in November, Saudi Arabia, for the first time ever, agreed to accept payment in Chinese yuan for crude oil. Has never happened before. The currency of oil trade and any other trade, of course, was the US dollar. Now we are undermining that. It might be very short-sighted. We might not even hit the right target. We are seeing that the sanctions are not as effective as the supporters of the sanctions have been expecting. And a final point on that. In June, the commentator Simon Jenkins in The Guardian said that the sanctions are feel-good symbolism. Only a European journalist can say that these sanctions are feel-good symbolism because they have negative effects, not so much for European societies, but for African, for Asian, and for Latin American societies, and we should think about them more intensely.
As you see, Europe is multi-faced. There are different views. Please allow me to say that you're right in saying that the effect of the crisis has been felt in different parts of the world, but saying that in Europe we didn't feel the effect, it would be a little bit, I mean, we are having huge prices, the inflation, which is not only linked to the war, but was accelerated by the war, with the energy bills soaring, the inflation is biting. I mean, in my country, Italy, the average salary is €1,500, sorry, and 1,500. If you have a 15% inflation in a couple of years, it means that you don't have money to pay for your rent, for your house, for whatever. So, and in Great Britain, mortgage bills exploded, and it's a big issue because they have a different way of paying. So it's an issue also for us. Then, of course, not food, like you mentioned in Africa. It's a completely different story. But Maslow taught us that you get accustomed to different level step by step, and so it's important. Now it's your time. We have time, as agreed, for question and answer. Question, not speeches, and answer, not speeches. First, the microphone is coming. Could you also say who you are posing the question to?
Thank you so much for panelists. I would like at first to introduce myself. My name is Marina Domushkina, and I was one of 3 negotiators for Black Sea Green Initiative to set up Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul. I would like to make 2 points, and I have a question. First of all, I'm glad that we are finally expanding the concept of security after war in Ukraine with the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, because now security is human security, food security, energy security, and climate security. However, I would like to raise your attention that we should stop saying food security, because we're already at the moment of food insecurity. And everything that's going on right now with Black Sea Green Initiative is just mitigating the impact of the invasion. And let's not forget that the ports were not operating for 6 months. And the impact that is there, we will feel only next year. Everything that we feel now is only the start. So I'm very grateful for some panelists who recognize that only the stop of war and Russian troops being fully leaving Ukraine and the Ukraine sovereignty will actually help to fix this issue. However, today there were several statements on that we should look into X, Y, that. So the question is, what would be the tools? What would be the tools to make African continent more sustainable and start producing? What would be the tools to start having more fertilizers? Because we are now talking about the food. Let's not forget that Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were the biggest producers of potash and nitrogen fertilizers. And this crisis will hit us. It already hits us. It will be not only about food accessibility that we have now with inflation. It will be about the food availability. And just 1 point about MOU, Russia is not addressing, it's mitigating the unprovoked invasion in Ukraine, in mitigating the impact to global food instability. Thank you. So the question will be particularly to Gwendolyn, because she was addressing about more production in African continent. And the question would be also to Herbert, who was saying about security and having really moderate views. So what would be then the tools, as you said, for overcoming the crisis that we are facing right now, and in fuel, fertilizers, and food, if not the stop of the invasion? Thank you.
This was really an exception, the length of the question and the comment. So please don't follow, I mean, not the content. I fully agree on the content and the question, but don't follow her example. I will not allow anyone else to speak. Don't get upset. I'm sorry. We have to respect, every one of us has to respect timing, whatever we say. Okay? Gwendolyn.
Thank you. Like I said, for me, this multitude of crises should be an opportunity for Africa. When you have a multitude of crises, it opens your eyes to see where you have weaknesses, and you normally should react. And I believe that in Africa, we should start thinking about producing our own foods. You have seen a lot of economies now in Africa, and I'll take Cameroon, for example, that have launched campaigns to see how they can go into agribusiness. They have worked with the financial sector to look into financing agribusiness, because it's a sector that in the past was never done. We were used to financing what brings money. We are not used to financing agriculture. The second thing is that we have to change skill capacities in the countries to be able to have people who have the skill to see what future work can be done, because right now, people were trained for, I would call it blue chip work, accounting and the rest. We didn't have training for agribusiness. So we have to change our training, our educational system to make it work. And also, if you look at countries like South Sudan, like Zimbabwe, that have been going through hyperinflation for the past 10 years and have had to come up with creative ways to still survive, that tells you that if you're critical and you're intentional about making a change, it will happen.
Thank you. Albert?
There are 2 options. One option is we could lift the sanctions regardless, and that is, of course, rather unpopular. The second option is that is the sanctioning countries could compensate those countries that are negatively affected as long as the sanctions are applied. I think that is only legitimate. If you apply a sanctions regime that does, of course, also affect Europeans, but it's not a question of life or death, it's a question of how rich the mascarpone on your sandwich is. For Europeans, this is manageable. For some African societies, it is not manageable. So if those countries that continue to apply sanctions, they should compensate, they should create a fund for those negatively affected. Because, as I said, they have not even been asked. But there is an alternative, which I already mentioned.
One second. No. It's interesting because you said one which is unrealistic, which is abolish sanction, meaning that the other one that we pay for the sanction to countries is realistic, which doesn't sound very realistic given what we see at COP and all these kind of meetings.
I'll be brief, but I just
A
want
title. I don't
title
agree.
plus
A title. I don't agree.
No, I'm not going to do I don't agree. I'm going to say a couple of things. Just factually, we can have different opinions about whether sanctions are a good or a bad idea, but we cannot say they've had no effect. And you can look at all the economic indicators. Russia is going to be the worst performing economy of the G20 projected. These are not my data. Look at the World Bank. It is starting to bite. It is starting to have an impact. Of course, we can discuss whether it should be. Whether that's the right approach. In my opinion, it is absolutely the right approach to hinder the war machine. But let's not sell that the sanctions are not working.
Okay.
That's simply
Benedetta,
not true.
you know, when Borrell was here, Borrell, when presented the first round of sanctions, said, we all know that sanctions will not win the war, but we have to impose sanctions. And Borrell said that because we know that sanctions do not work. We need to impose them. We have used sanctions to the American to destroy the communist system in Cuba, which is still there. We have used sanctions to get rid of the Ayatollah in Iran, and they are still there. We have sanctions on Venezuela, and the guy is still there. So we know that, but it's something which is needed, and it's the only alternative we have to react with a war. More questions, please. One here. Now we are all disciplined because we have the last 10 minutes.
So the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shown that Europe is interlinked with Asia, whether that be Southeast Asia, South Asia. And the food shortages and the economic impacts of the war are hitting us really hard. So Europe is expecting this reaction to come out of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Asia in general, the Indo-Pacific, if you will, from a security perspective. Is Europe now thinking about, and this is more to Benedetta, to engage with Southeast Asia or South Asia in an economic way? Because this is really the crux of the matter, right? For South Asia, for Southeast Asia, this is an economic issue as well. Yes, as Sachin said, we may not dispassionately be linked, but we are economically linked. So when the Europeans say we're not going to be a part of the CPTPPE because we don't join economic sort of groupings that we haven't birthed, it really gives people in Asia, questions about, does Europe care about Asia only when their interests are concerned?
Good, we got it. Benedetta, very quickly, and also Herbert, though, both.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking to a NATO official, so yeah. I'm not going to be able to comment so much on the EU policies, but I will comment on your point about the growing understanding of the interlinkages. I think that's very important. I think we are, from a NATO perspective, we are deliberately reaching out more and working more with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region. We also make the case. I'll stop. I see that I have to be quick, but we also make the case that yes, we have to work together, economic cooperation. We also make the case that what is happening right now in Europe, and I really think it's important, has reverberation, as you see, globally, but also has a long-term impact on the rules-based international order. And whatever is happening today in Europe can happen tomorrow in East Asia. If you're worried about certain competitors in your region, if you're worried about China, I don't think that...
I didn't want you to be short, Benedetta. I just underlined the point you made. It's bizarre to have a question on Europe and on trade answered by a NATO fissure, which NATO is not trade, and NATO is not Europe. So that's why I was underlining your point.
Well, NATO is not Europe. It's an alliance of 30 countries, 28 of which are European.
Okay, Benedetta, I had a degree at the university. I know what is NATO. I'm not saying that it doesn't coincide. It doesn't coincide with Europe, of course. Come on, Heribert.
I think your proposal is excellent. The proposal that the European Union and the United States of America should join CPTPP, regardless of who has created it. The trouble is we don't have a functioning multilateral trading regime at the moment. I'm quoting Prime Minister Modi, who said that at the beginning of the week. He said multilateralism has failed. According to my assessment, we will not see a revitalization of the World Trade Organization anytime soon. We need something that is better and easier to manage for companies than bilateral trade agreements. So we need a large trade agreement that brings together not like-minded countries, but market economies. I'm very much against this exclusion and inclusion of friends and foes. We only want to have gas from Norway and Denmark. Well, it would be, in an ideal world, it would be like that, but that won't happen. So we should emphasize the market economy, but we shouldn't say we only want to have democracies in that club. That is a step too far. It's promoted by the United States and the finance minister of the United States, but I don't think it is appropriate. There must be a place for organizing trade between market economies.
Dino want to say something? You said there are no more questions, but I still have a few minutes. So is there any reason I have to stop? Which I don't know? No. Which is a good, which is a very good point. No, let's say we take two more questions, but first, Dino.
Yeah.
No, I take you.
I'm going to say something that Benedetta from NATO would not like, which is this, and this is Southeast Asian view, so kindly listen to our views. China has just come up with a 12-point plan on Ukraine, ending the Ukraine war. It's not a perfect plan, but don't let your strategic ego close your eyes. In 1980s, there was China and the United States and ASEAN worked together, despite their strategic differences, to resolve the Cambodian conflict. And that conflict stands today with the Paris Treaty in 1991. Same thing. Of all the leaders in the world, who does Putin listen to most, right? Not Biden, not Olaf, not Macron, right? Not this and that. It's Xi Jinping, whether we like it or not, right? And the state of diplomatic and political strategic dependency, if you say it, from Russia towards Beijing is higher than ever. So I would say, look, keep an open mind and coordinate and talk to China and see what you guys can do together.
Kissinger remarks coming at the end of our panel. There are two questions more. One.
We've heard from the African region, the Asian region, the European region. I wanted to ask basically all of the panelists what their prospects are. With every crisis, there's an opportunity. What they think about diversifying imports for food and fuel from a more peaceful region and reliable partners such as Latin America on the one hand, and on the other hand, for the prospect of enhanced investment in said region, especially when we're talking about energy, such as could be gas, shale oil and gas in Argentina, or energy critical minerals such as lithium in the lithium triangle.
You are a great marketing manager of your country. Great. Well done. Well done. Let's take the other question together with this. By coincidence, his country sells most of the things he mentioned. Good point. You have a future as a trade minister of Argentina. Where is the last question?
I would like to ask a question regarding the protection of people working in commodities field in developing countries and in continents outside of Europe. Basically, right now we have zero act by countries to help make it a fair trade and sustainable supply chain, and everything is up to private initiative. So I was wondering, what is your perspective of how countries can help solve that, like helping solve the diamond industry? And I want to say that we have expert here presenting their professional opinions from their places of work, and they shouldn't be addressed as representing continents or group age. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure we won't be able to answer in 2 minutes to these two questions, but I will give 1 minute to each of the panelists to make a final comment addressing also this question, starting from Sachin.
Thank you, Paolo. I think I would just like to draw your attention on a study we did on imports from China in India. And what we found was that there are some 4,438 commodities that India is importing from China. And in almost 48% of those items, we found that Latin American countries are far more competitive in production. The challenge comes in at two levels. One, trade facilitating infrastructure. So China has invested huge on trade facilitating infrastructure. And second is easier movement through sea lanes. I think the moment we address this, Latin America and Asian consumers would not be very far.
Benedetta?
Well, yes, with every crisis, there's an opportunity. In this case, it's a very difficult one to say, but I believe that learning the lesson about lessening critical dependencies is very important. And part of that is diversification. It is something that European countries are investing into quite rapidly, together with more sustainability. So that is the recipe. And of course, that on the very eloquent pitch, sales pitch, I'm not the right customer, being from a security organization, but I definitely see. I definitely understand. Just 1 second on the various peace plans. I would just say, well, first of all, point taken, but it's not for me. And I think it's very important to say, if we're talking about political settlement or any political settlement, put someone from Ukraine here on the panel and have them talk about what they would like for their country, not me. So I take it, but I would just suggest you read the 10-point Zelensky's peace plan. That's a good place to start, in my opinion.
Dino.
Yeah, well, crisis to opportunity. In 2004, we had the worst tsunami crisis ever in our history. We turned that into a political peace process in Aceh, permanent. 2008, we have a global financial crisis, and out of that, we created a new global financial architecture, especially with the G20. Yeah? Presently, I don't see tradecraft and statesmanship that will be able to somewhat deliver us to a better and reformed world. I'm not seeing any important initiatives. In fact, what we're seeing is obviously the deepening of rivalries and the deepening of strategic mistrust. That makes me feel a bit, distressed, yeah?
Heribert?
The late Jack Welch, who was chairman of General Electric, said once that the ideal factory should be mounted to a barge that you can take from country to country. That is globalization. We see that at the moment there are rescheduling or reconfigurations of supply chains. Just this morning, I read that Hon Hai Precision Industries, which is Foxconn, is building 2 factories here in India to manufacture iPhones and other Apple products with an employment of 100,000 people in each factory. So this is happening. It's a normal process, and I'm confident that this will continue. And probably I have been in India too long to be such an optimist at the end of the session, but I think globalization will continue. It will change, but it will not end.
Thank you. Gwendolyn?
For me, we have been hearing for so many years, Africa is the future. And I believe that the multiple crises, be it financial, political, health, and the rest, and now the Ukraine crisis, just goes to remind us that we need to sit up and take our future in our hands. Africa has the young population. Africa has skilled labor. Africa has fertile land. Africa has, I think, the biggest capacity of hydroelectricity. Africa has gas, it has minerals, and we have to stop the narrative of Africa is the future. we have to become self-dependent, and we have to forge our own regional trade partnerships that work, so that we are not reliant plainly on some countries, but we can make multiple and interconnected partnerships that work for us. That, for me, is what Africa should focus on.
Thank you, Gwendolyn. It was a pleasure, a real pleasure. Allow me one word to conclude this wonderful panel. I wish to thank all the panelists. The key word we have used is diversification. Let me, in a humble way, remind you that diversification has the same etymology of diversity. And diversity means diversity of view, accepting people believing in something different, listening to other views. And I say this because the new word we're getting in after COVID and after the war is a very polarized word, a word in which we cannot talk freely and say freely that on something we are not 100% sure, that we have doubt. There is no black and white. So diversification is crucial, diversity is crucial as well. Good luck for your future, and thank you to our panelists.